The cold is not a temperature here, it is a physical weight, a thick, invisible shroud that clings to the lungs. Prince Julian's breath didn't mist in the air. It seemed to vanish, swallowed by the unnatural density of the pines. Every step he took through the pale ridge felt like an intrusion upon a funeral that had been in progress for a millennium. The trees were the first things to distort. They were not merely wood and bark. Their trunks were twisted in agonizing spirals, the knots in the wood resembling eyes that tracked his movement with a fixed, wooden malice. There was no birdsong. There was no scuttle of insects. The silence was so absolute that Julian could hear the friction of his own eyelashes when he blinked, a dry, rhythmic scratching that sounded like sandpaper against his skull. He had been walking since the sun was a pale, sickly coin in the sky, but now the light was curdling into a bruised purple. He reached a clearing where the earth was scorched black, not by fire, but by something that had sucked the life out of the soil. In the center of the clearing stood a monolithic stone, jagged and sharp, wrapped in chains that had rusted into the very grain of the rock. Beside the stone lay the first of the offerings. It was a stag, its antlers massive and sprawling like the branches of the trees around it. It lay on its side, perfectly intact. No predator had touched it. No rot had set in. But as Julian approached, he saw the horror of it. The stag's eyes were open, and they were swirling with a liquid, milky white substance. Its chest was still, but the skin was rippling. Something was moving beneath the hide, not a parasite, but a shift in the creature's very geometry, as if its bones were being rearranged into a shape that shouldn't exist in 3 dimensions. Julian backed away, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He turned to run, but the path he had taken was gone. In its place stood a wall of fog so thick it felt like wet wool against his skin. Then the sound started. It was a low, guttural vibration that didn't come from any specific direction. It hummed in his teeth. It vibrated in the marrow of his shins. It was a growl, but it held the tonal complexity of 1,000 voices whispering in unison. "Who's there?" Julian shouted. The fog seemed to eat his words, dampening them until they were barely a whimper. A shadow detached itself from the base of a great pine. It didn't move like an animal. It unfolded. The creature was a nightmare of scale and silence. It was a wolf in the way a hurricane is a breeze, a massive skeletal frame draped in fur that seemed to absorb the meager light of the forest. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at angles that defied the laws of anatomy. It didn't leap. It didn't rush. It simply was closer. With every blink Julian took, the creature gained 10 feet. Blink. It was at the edge of the clearing. Blink. It was beside the chained stone. Blink. It was standing directly over the stag. The wolf lowered its head, its snout hovering just an inch above the stag's glassy eye. It inhaled. Julian watched in paralyzed fascination as a pale, shimmering vapor was pulled from the stag's nostrils directly into the wolf's mouth. The stag's body didn't just go limp, it became translucent, turning into a hollow husk of gray ash that crumbled into the wind. The wolf turned its head. Its eyes were not eyes at all, but 2 freezing voids of absolute nothingness. Julian felt a sharp, electric sting in the back of his neck. His memories began to pulse. He saw the great hall of his father's castle, but the tapestries were bleeding black ink. He saw his coronation, but the crown was made of teeth. The wolf was reaching into him, sorting through the layers of his consciousness like a man looking for a specific page in a dusty book. "The blood of the usurper is sour." A voice echoed in Julian's mind. It wasn't a sound. It was a memory that hadn't been there a second ago. "But the blood of the lost prince, that is old. That is deep. That is the debt I was promised when the stars were young." The creature took a step toward him. The ground didn't crack. It groaned. Julian felt the first wave of true psychological collapse. The realization that his physical body was no longer his own. His fingers were beginning to lengthen. His skin was turning the color of the fog. The wolf opened its maw, and inside, Julian didn't see teeth. He saw a swirling vortex of faces. Thousands of them, all frozen in a scream of silent realization. "I have nothing to give you!" Julian screamed, clutching his head as the pressure behind his eyes became unbearable. "My kingdom is gone! My family is dead!" The wolf leaned in, its breath smelling of ancient ice and ozone. "I do not want your kingdom, little prince." The voice vibrated through his skull. I want the 937 years of life you are about to give me." The wolf's shadow began to stretch out, detaching from its body and crawling across the dead grass toward Julian's feet. As the shadow touched his boots, Julian felt his shins snap and reform. He fell to his knees, not in pain, but in a state of horrific, numbing ecstasy. He looked up at the wolf and realized the creature was growing smaller, its form becoming more human, more defined. While Julian was becoming the shadow. The wolf, now standing on two legs, its form shimmering into the likeness of a tall, pale man with Julian's own face, reached down and touched Julian's new, fur-covered brow. "Do you know why I chose you?" the man who looked like Julian whispered. The man who wore Julian's face didn't blink. His skin had the porcelain sheen of something newly birthed, yet his eyes remained those two freezing pits of white static. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of Julian's now distorted jaw. "I chose you," the doppelganger whispered, "because you were already hollow. A prince with no kingdom is just a ghost waiting for a shape. You didn't fight the woods, Julian. You invited them in the moment you crossed the ridge." Julian tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with wet earth. His perspective was shifting. He was no longer looking up at the man. He was looking through 1,000 different points of light at once. He could feel the pulse of the moss 3 miles away. He could feel the slow, agonizing calcification of a sapling's roots. The forest wasn't around him anymore. It was him. The doppelganger stood up, smoothing the silks of Julian's royal tunic. "The debt isn't just a life, Julian. It's a transition. Every 900 years, the great wolf must walk among men to remind them why they fear the dark. And every 900 years, a soul of royal weight must take the mantle of the Watcher. You aren't dying. You are expanding." Julian felt his consciousness fragmenting. The memory of his mother's voice didn't just fade. It tore into 1,000,000 pieces, each piece becoming a needle of ice in his veins. He looked at his hands again. They weren't hands. They were paws of shadow and bone, claws made of obsidian that seemed to drip a darkness so thick it stained the air. "Walk!" the man commanded. Julian's body, the massive, hulking frame of the 937-year-old entity, moved without his consent. It was a terrifying, fluid motion, a predatory grace that felt utterly alien. He moved through the trees, and the forest parted for him like water. The man who looked like Julian followed closely behind, his leather boots crunching on the dry needles with a sound that felt like a mockery. They reached a canyon where the trees grew horizontally out of the rock faces, their branches weaving a canopy so dense that time seemed to stop. In the center of the canyon was a lake. The water wasn't blue or green. It was a perfect polished mirror of black glass. "Look," the doppelganger said, pointing to the water. Julian leaned over the edge. In the reflection, he didn't see the wolf. He saw a city of white stone and gold spires, humming with the sound of 1,000,000 lives. But as he watched, a shadow began to crawl over the city walls. It wasn't a cloud. It was a massive, paw-shaped darkness that blotted out the sun. He saw himself, or rather, the creature he had become, standing on the highest peak above the city. He saw the city's inhabitants look up, their faces contorting not with fear, but with a sudden total loss of identity. One by one, they became translucent. One by one, they turned into gray ash. "That is the future," the man said, his voice dripping with a cold, synthetic warmth. "The bloodline of the usurper thinks they won a crown. They don't realize they only won the right to be the next harvest. You are the scythe, Julian. I am simply the hand that swings it." Suddenly, the man's face began to crack. Not like skin, but like dry clay. Small pieces of Julian fell away, revealing a shifting, chaotic mass of light underneath. "The transition is nearly complete," the entity said, its voice now layered with the echoes of everyone it had ever consumed. "But there is one thing you must do before I leave you to your watch. One memory you must kill. If you keep it, the hunger will never be satisfied. You will be a beast that knows it is a beast, and that is a special kind of hell." The entity reached into the air and pulled a shimmering thread of gold from nothingness. Inside the thread, Julian saw a memory of himself as a child, sitting in a sun-drenched garden, holding a small wooden bird his father had carved for him. It was the only moment in his life where he had felt completely, undeniably safe. "Eat it," the entity commanded, holding the thread toward the wolf's snout. "Consume the last of your humanity, or the hunger will tear you apart from the inside out." Julian felt the hunger then. It wasn't a stomach crave, it was a soul crave. It was a vacuum in the center of his being that demanded to be filled. The golden thread smelled like summer rain and honey. It was beautiful. It was everything he was. His massive jaws began to open. His teeth, each the size of a dagger, hovered over the glowing memory. But as the light hit his white, pupilless eyes, he saw something else within the memory, a detail he had forgotten, a secret his father had whispered into the wooden bird before giving it to him. Julian froze. The hunger screamed. The entity's eyes narrowed, the Julian mask slipping further to reveal the cosmic rot beneath. "Why do you hesitate?" the entity hissed. "Eat and be free of the pain." Julian didn't eat. Instead, he turned his massive, shadowed head toward the entity. He realized that the debt wasn't something his ancestors had owed. It was a trap they had set. The bird wasn't a gift, Julian's thought voice rumbled, shaking the very stones of the canyon. It was a key. The entity's composure shattered. The forest around them began to howl, not with wind, but with a collective shriek of realization. The black lake began to boil. "What have you done?" the entity roared, its form expanding until it blocked out the sky, a towering pillar of screaming faces. Julian looked down at his own shadowed paws and saw the golden thread beginning to wrap around his claws, turning the darkness into something solid, something bright, something ancient that the wolf had forgotten it could be. The golden thread didn't just glow, it began to hum with a frequency that vibrated through the wolf's massive skeletal frame, turning the shadows of his fur into solid, iridescent light. The entity, the thing wearing Julian's face, recoiled, its features melting like wax too close to a furnace. "The debt cannot be subverted," it shrieked, the voices of 1,000 consumed souls layering into a discordant wall of sound. "The bloodline signed the pact in the shadow of the first tree. You are the vessel, Julian. You are the cage." But Julian, trapped within the titanic form of the wolf, was no longer listening to the entity. He was looking at the wooden bird within the memory. In the sun-drenched garden of his childhood, his father hadn't just carved a toy. He had carved a sequence of runes into the internal grain of the wood, hidden beneath the wings. Julian's father had known. The kings of the Pale Ridge had always known. They weren't just monarchs, they were jailers. And the debt wasn't a payment of souls. It was a biological timer. The wooden bird in the memory split open, and from its hollow belly, a single word of old command echoed through Julian's consciousness. Release. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The golden thread wrapped around Julian's obsidian claws tightened, then snapped. The energy didn't dissipate, it inverted. The vacuum at the center of Julian's soul, the hunger that had been screaming for satisfaction, suddenly reversed its polarity. He wasn't a hunter anymore. He was a conduit. The black boiling lake in the center of the canyon erupted. Thousands of translucent shapes began to pour out of the wolf's own shadow, streaming upward like reverse rain. These were the souls the wolf had gathered over 937 years, the peasants, the knights, the previous princes who had failed to find the key. They weren't being digested, they were being stored. And now the storehouse was bursting. The entity screamed as the souls tore through its shimmering synthetic form. The Julian mask was the first to go, shredded into pale ribbons. Beneath it lay a core of pure, pulsing malice, a weeping eye of cosmic proportions that blinked in the sudden light of the released spirits. "You fool!" the eye roared, its voice shaking the canyon walls until the horizontal trees snapped like dry twigs. "If you release them, there is nothing left to hold the forest together. The ridge will collapse. The world will see what lives in the dark." "Let them see," Julian's thought voice rumbled. Julian felt his physical form begin to dissolve. The massive 7-foot frame of the wolf was flaking away into embers. The obsidian claws turned to smoke. The white, pupilless eyes began to burn with a fierce human gold. As the wolf disintegrated, the environment followed. The fog that had acted as a wall turned into a hurricane of gray ash. The eyes in the tree trunks began to weep a thick amber sap that smelled of ancient rot. The very geometry of the forest began to flatten, the three-dimensional nightmare losing its grip on reality. In the center of the chaos, Julian saw the entity, the eye, shrinking. Without the weight of the souls to anchor it, without a royal vessel to inhabit, the cosmic force was becoming a pathetic, twitching thing on the scorched earth. Julian, now a flickering consciousness hovering between the physical and the eternal, drifted toward the shrinking eye. He felt no hate. He felt only a profound, cold clarity. 937 years, Julian whispered into the mind of the entity. That's a long time to be afraid of a wooden bird. The eye gave one final wet shudder and vanished into a pinprick of black light, leaving behind nothing but a small, charred circle on the ground. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the forest. It wasn't heavy or predatory. It was the silence of a room after a long, agonizing scream has finally ended. Julian felt his spirit being pulled in two directions, one toward the white light where the thousands of released souls had vanished, and one back toward the cold, hard reality of the pale ridge. He looked down. His body was lying in the center of the clearing, near the monolithic stone. He looked like a corpse, gaunt, pale, his royal silks tattered and stained with the gray ash of the forest. But his chest was moving. A slow, shallow rise and fall. He was alive, but he was not alone. As Julian's consciousness slammed back into his physical meat, he gasped, his lungs burning as they tasted real, thin mountain air for the first time in days. He pushed himself up on trembling hands, coughing out the taste of wet earth. The forest was gone. In its place was a barren, rocky plateau. The ancient pines were nothing but petrified stumps. The smudge on the map had been erased. The sun was rising over the horizon, a true golden sun that didn't feel like a sickly coin. Julian stood up, his bones aching with the weight of 1,000 years he hadn't actually lived. He turned to leave, to find whatever was left of the world he had abandoned. But then he stopped. There, at the edge of the plateau, sat a small gray wolf. It wasn't 7 feet tall. It wasn't made of shadows. It was just a wolf, thin, scarred, and very, very old. It watched him with eyes that were no longer white, but a deep, piercing amber. The wolf stood up and bowed its head toward Julian, a gesture of profound, terrifying respect. Then it turned and began to walk toward the distant mountains. Julian reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against something hard and wooden. He pulled it out. It was the wooden bird, but it was no longer a toy. It was carved from a wood that didn't exist anymore, and when Julian held it to his ear, he didn't hear the wind. He heard a heartbeat, and it wasn't his. Julian looked back at the charred circle where the entity had vanished. He realized then that the revelation hadn't been about ending the cycle. It had been about changing the gardener. The 937-year-old immortal wasn't the wolf. The wolf was just the shadow. The question is, if the prince is now the master of the shadow, what is he planning to do with the 1,000 years of hunger he just inherited? Julian stood at the edge of the petrified plateau, the wooden bird clicking rhythmically in his palm like a countdown. The small amber-eyed wolf had vanished into the mountain mist, but the silence it left behind wasn't empty. It was hungry. The transformation hadn't been a cleansing. It had been a redistribution. As Julian looked down at his reflection in a pool of rainwater trapped in a cracked rock, he didn't see the haggard, broken prince who had crawled into the woods to die. He saw a man whose skin seemed to hum with a faint bioluminescent silver, and whose shadow, even in the high clear sun, stretched 20 feet long and moved with a predatory twitch of its own. He began the long descent toward the lowlands, toward the kingdom of his father's murderer. Every step he took away from the pale ridge felt like dragging an invisible chain. The hunger started as a dull ache in his jaw, then moved to his mind. It wasn't a desire for food. It was a craving for history. As he passed an abandoned charcoal burner's hut at the foot of the mountain, Julian didn't see just the rotted wood and the cold hearth. He saw the ghosts of every conversation held within those walls. He saw the grief of the widow who had left it 50 years ago. He reached out and touched the doorframe. The wood shivered. A surge of gray light rushed up Julian's arm, and suddenly the widow's grief was his. He felt her cold, her loneliness, her final breath, and the ache in his jaw eased, just for a moment. "You're feeding!" a voice rasped from the shadows of the hut. Julian spun, his shadow lashing out like a whip, cracking the stone ground. An old man sat on a stump, his eyes milky with cataracts, wearing the tattered livery of the royal house of the sun, Julian's father's house. He was a survivor of the coup, a man who had been a general when Julian was a boy. "General Kale?" Julian whispered. The old man didn't look up. He couldn't see with his eyes, but he tilted his head as if listening to the vibration of Julian's soul. "I knew the wolf would come eventually, but I didn't think it would come wearing the prince's skin." "The wolf is gone," Julian said, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "I broke the cycle. I released the souls." Kale let out a dry, hacking laugh. "Released them! Prince, you didn't release them. You unbound them. You took the lid off a pressure cooker that has been simmering for 1,000 years. Those souls didn't go to the heavens. They're out there wandering the kingdom, confused, angry, and cold, and they are looking for a sun to huddle around." Julian looked back at the mountain. He saw thin, translucent trails of smoke rising from the valleys. Thousands of them. They weren't smoke. They were the echoes of the 937 years of the dead. "The entity. The eye. It told me the bloodline was a cage," Julian said, the wooden bird in his hand pulsing faster now. "It was," Kale agreed, finally standing. He pointed a shaking finger at Julian's shadow. "But a cage serves two purposes, boy. It keeps the monster in, and it keeps the world out. You've destroyed the cage, but you kept the hunger. And now, the usurper sits in your father's throne, oblivious to the fact that the ghost he feared isn't coming for revenge. It's coming to eat the very memory of his reign." Julian felt a wave of nausea. He realized that the truth the entity had hidden was far more disturbing than a simple debt. The wolf hadn't been a separate creature. It was a manifestation of the kingdom's collective trauma, given a physical form by the royal bloodline. By releasing it, Julian hadn't ended the nightmare. He had turned himself into the epicenter of a psychic plague. "If I don't go back," Julian said, "if I stay in the wild, then you will become exactly what the first wolf was," Kale interrupted. "A mindless void that consumes everything it touches until there's nothing left but a smudge on a map. But if you go to the city, if you face the man who killed your father—" Julian's shadow suddenly reared up, towering over the hut, its shape no longer resembling a wolf or a man, but a swirling vortex of teeth and stars. "I don't want to kill him," Julian realized, a cold, dark epiphany blooming in his chest. "I want to be him. I want to take his years. I want to take his every thought until he never existed at all." The hunger in his mind roared in approval. He turned toward the capital city of Oakhaven. It was a 3-day journey, but Julian knew he wouldn't be walking. He closed his eyes and felt the thousands of wandering souls in the valley. He felt their tether to him, the new master of the shadow. He didn't walk. He shifted. In a heartbeat, he was miles ahead, the landscape blurring into a smear of gray and gold. He was moving through the collective memory of the land, using the spirits of the dead as stepping stones. As he neared the outskirts of the city, the air began to thicken. The sky turned a bruised, unnatural yellow. The people in the fields dropped their tools. They didn't run. They simply stood still, their heads tilting in unison toward the approaching shadow, their eyes beginning to glaze over with a familiar milky white film. Julian stood on a hill overlooking Oakhaven. The gold spires he had seen in the lake reflection were there, shimmering in the afternoon light. But as he looked at them, his shadow began to bleed into the soil, turning the green grass to ash. He pulled the wooden bird from his pocket. It was vibrating so hard now it was drawing blood from his palm. The heartbeat inside it was no longer a steady rhythm. It was a frantic, terrified drumbeat. He realized the heartbeat wasn't the wolf's. It wasn't his father's. It was the city's,